I'm Lily. Well, that's what everyone calls me. My full name is Lillian Harper, but honestly, it feels too formal for someone who spends most of her time in oversized sweaters and yoga pants, binge-watching Netflix while pretending I have my life together. And trust me, if you knew me 5 years ago, the girl who used to meticulously plan every detail of her existence, you'd think I was a completely different person now. Life has this funny way of humbling you. James proposed on a rainy Tuesday night. Not exactly the romantic, perfect moment you see in movies, but it was ours. We were sitting on the couch, sipping cheap red wine from mismatched glasses because we couldn't afford anything fancier back then. He turned to me, his brown eyes soft under the dim lamplight, and said, "Lily, will you marry me?" No grand gesture, no ring. He promised one would come later. Just those 7 words that somehow felt more real than any over-the-top proposal ever could. At first, everything seemed perfect. James had this charming mix of ambition and goofiness. He'd talk about his dreams of starting his own tech company while simultaneously making terrible puns that made me groan laugh into my pillow. I loved how he always smelled faintly of cologne and coffee, even though he worked long hours at some corporate job downtown. He was my rock, or so I thought. But looking back now, the cracks started showing much earlier than I wanted to admit, like when he began canceling our Friday date nights because work got in the way, or when he stopped laughing at my jokes unless they were convenient for him, or when he started glancing at his phone during conversations, as if whatever was happening on that screen was more important than what I had to say. At the time, I brushed it off. Everyone gets busy, right? Relationships ebb and flow. That's normal, isn't it? Then there was Sarah. She wasn't technically part of us, but she might as well have been. Sarah was James's coworker, a bubbly blonde with an annoying habit of ending every sentence with, "you know?" She joined their team about 2 years into our relationship, and suddenly James started coming home later, talking about her nonstop. Sarah suggested, "Sarah did this amazing presentation today. It drove me insane, but not enough to confront him outright. Instead, I buried my feelings deep down where they festered like a wound left untreated. One evening, after yet another canceled dinner reservation, I decided to surprise James at his office. I figured maybe seeing me there would remind him of us, that we still mattered. But when I walked through the glass doors of his building, clutching a paper bag filled with takeout boxes, I froze. There he was, standing near the water cooler, laughing with Sarah. Her hand rested casually on his arm, and his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. My stomach churned, and for a second, I considered turning around and leaving before either of them noticed me. But something inside snapped. I marched over, forcing a smile onto my face. "Hey, babe," I said brightly, holding up the bag. "Thought you might be hungry." James blinked at me, clearly startled. Then his expression shifted. Guilt flickered across his features before being replaced by irritation. "Lily, what are you doing here?" "I brought food," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the lump forming in my throat. "Figured we could eat together since you've been so busy lately." Sarah gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, hi, Lily. Fancy running into you here?" "Yeah," I muttered, feeling like an intruder in my own relationship. Fancy. The rest of the interaction passed in a blur. James dismissed me with a vague promise to call later, and I left without touching the food. On the drive home, tears streamed down my face, blurring the city lights outside my window. For the first time, I let myself entertain the horrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, James didn't love me anymore. The days after that humiliating office visit felt like walking on eggshells, or maybe shards of glass would be a better description. Every word James said, every glance he gave me, carried this weird weight that made my chest tighten. He didn't apologize for Sarah's hand lingering on his arm or the way he'd looked at her like she hung the damn moon. Instead, he acted like nothing had happened, like I hadn't caught him mid-laugh with someone who wasn't me. "You're overreacting," he told me one night when I finally worked up the courage to bring it up. We were sitting in our tiny kitchen, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, like an annoying mosquito you can't swat away. I was stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce, pretending I wasn't shaking inside. "It's just work stuff, Lily. You know how it is." "No, James, I don't," I shot back, slamming the spoon down harder than I meant to. Sauce splattered onto the counter, but neither of us moved to clean it up. "I don't get why you're suddenly spending all your time with her instead of, I don't know, your fiancé?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a move I used to find endearing, but now found infuriating. "You're making this into something it's not. Sarah's just a coworker. She helps me out sometimes. That's it." "That's it?" My voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and I hated myself for sounding so weak. "Then why does it feel like you care more about impressing her than being with me?" James stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched like he was biting back words he didn't want to say. Finally, he muttered, "Maybe if you weren't so insecure," and that was the first punch below the belt. Not even a real fight yet, but already, he was trying to twist things around, make me the problem. Classic deflection tactic. But hey, what did I expect? This was James, the guy who could charm his way out of anything, including accountability. Few weeks later, I met Aria. She was my lifeline during those dark days, though I didn't realize it at first. Aria owned the little flower shop 2 blocks from our apartment, and she always greeted me with this warm smile that felt like sunshine breaking through through clouds. One afternoon, I wandered in there after another argument with James, my eyes red and puffy from crying. "Rough day?" Arya asked gently, arranging a bouquet of sunflowers behind the counter. She had this effortless grace about her, long curly hair tied back in a messy bun, paint-splattered jeans, and a nose ring that somehow managed to look elegant rather than rebellious. "You could say that," I mumbled, picking at a loose thread on my sweater. She nodded knowingly, setting the flowers aside and leaning against the counter. "Men are idiots sometimes. Want to talk about it?" I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to unload my problems onto a near stranger. But there was something about Arya, her calm demeanor, the way she listened without interrupting, that made me trust her almost instantly. So I spilled everything: the canceled dates, the late-night texts from Sarah, the growing distance between James and me. By the end, I was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching a tissue she'd handed me like it was a lifeline. "You deserve better," she said firmly, once I'd calmed down enough to breathe normally again. "Anyone who makes you feel small doesn't deserve your love." Her words hit me like a freight train. No one had ever said that to me before, not even myself. For years, I'd convinced myself that James's flaws were just part of loving someone deeply, that putting up with his mood swings and emotional neglect was proof of my devotion. But hearing Arya call it what it really was, bullshit, woke something up inside me. Still, old habits die hard. Even after that conversation, I kept trying to fix things with James. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was fear of being alone, or maybe I just couldn't let go of the idea that we were supposed to last forever. Whatever it was, I found myself bending over backward to win him back, to prove that I was worth staying for. One Saturday morning, I woke up early and baked his favorite chocolate chip cookies. The smell filled the apartment, sweet and comforting, and for a moment I let myself believe it might actually work. When James came out of the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes, I greeted him with a hopeful smile. "I thought we could spend the day together," I said, handing him a cookie. "Just us. No phones, no distractions." He took the cookie but didn't meet my eyes. "Actually, I promised Sarah I'd help her with something today. Some project deadline." My heart sank, but I forced another smile. "Oh, okay. Another time then." As he got ready to leave, I stood in the doorway, watching him grab his keys and jacket. "James," I called out before he could walk out, "do you still love me?" He froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. For a second, I thought he might turn around, hug me, tell me he loved me more than anything. But instead, he shrugged and said, "Love isn't enough, Lily." And just like that, the floor dropped out from under me. Those 5 words, so casual, so dismissive, cut deeper than any insult ever could, because they weren't angry or spiteful, they were indifferent. And indifference is the cruelest kind of goodbye. That night, I sat on the couch staring at the blank TV screen, replaying his words over and over in my head. Outside, rain hammered against the windows, matching the storm brewing inside me. Felt hollow, like someone had scooped out all the pieces of me that mattered and left behind an empty shell. But amidst the pain, there was also clarity. For the first time, I understood what Arya meant when she said I deserved better. Love shouldn't hurt this much. It shouldn't make you question your worth or beg for scraps of affection. Real love should lift you up, not tear you down. So I made a decision, one that terrified me but also felt inevitable. Tomorrow, I would start packing my things. Tomorrow, I would leave James and figure out how to rebuild my life without him. Because as broken as I felt right now, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to stay somewhere I didn't belong. The morning after James's careless dismissal, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that felt like lead. My throat was raw from crying myself to sleep, and the apartment was eerily quiet. No sound of James moving around or brewing his usual coffee. He'd spent the night at Sarah's place again, something he did more often these days without even bothering to ask. If it bothered me, and honestly, it didn't bother me anymore. Not in the way it used to. Instead, there was this strange numbness settling over me, like my emotions had been wrapped in bubble wrap to protect them from further damage. I got out of bed slowly, shuffling toward the kitchen like a zombie. The sun streamed through the blinds in golden streaks, but it didn't feel warm. It felt mocking, like the universe was laughing at me for thinking I could ever have a happy ending. On autopilot, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the table, staring blankly at the calendar hanging on the wall. Today's date stared back at me innocuously, completely unaware that it marked the beginning of the end. Packing wasn't as simple as throwing clothes into boxes. Every item I touched carried memories, good and bad, that made my hands tremble. His old hoodie, which smelled faintly of him even after months of sitting untouched in the closet. The photo album we'd started together during our first year as a couple, filled with pictures of us smiling under fireworks and holding hands at the beach. Even the stupid fridge magnet shaped like a pineapple that he'd won at some carnival game and insisted we keep because it's quirky. Each object was a tiny anchor tying me to him, and letting go felt like ripping stitches off a wound before it had fully healed. But I couldn't stop. I reminded myself why I was doing this, not just because James had chosen someone else over me, but because staying would mean losing myself completely. So I packed everything methodically, labeling each box with Sharpie scrawl, clothes, books, kitchen stuff. When I reached the bottom drawer of our shared dresser, I hesitated. Buried underneath a pile of mismatched socks was the ring box James had promised me 5 years ago, the one he never actually gave me. I opened it now, half expecting it to be empty, but inside lay a simple diamond solitaire band. For a moment, I let myself wonder what might have happened if he'd followed through, if he'd gotten down on one knee and slipped it onto my finger, instead of keeping it hidden away like some forgotten promise. Would things have turned out differently, or was this inevitable all along? By mid-afternoon, I needed a break. Packing was exhausting both physically and emotionally, so I decided to take a walk to clear my head. As I stepped outside, the crisp autumn air hit me like a slap, jolting me awake. Leaves crunched beneath my boots as I wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. People always seemed to know when you were falling apart. They looked at you too long, their expressions softening with pity. And right now, I couldn't handle that kind of attention. Eventually, I found myself standing outside Aria's flower shop. Its windows were decorated with garlands of ivy and twinkling fairy lights, making it look cozy despite the grayness of the day. Without really thinking about it, I pushed open the door, the bell above it chiming softly. "Hey," Aria said, looking up from where she was arranging a bouquet of white roses. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw my face. "You okay?" "No," I admitted, collapsing onto a stool near the counter. "Not even close." She set the flowers aside and came over, perching next to me. "What happened?" So I told her everything, from finding James with Sarah at work, to the night he casually dismissed our relationship with those soul-crushing words. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face again, but this time they weren't just sad tears. They were angry ones, fueled by the realization that I'd wasted so much of myself on someone who didn't deserve me. Aria listened, patiently, nodding occasionally, but mostly letting me vent until I ran out of steam. Then she leaned forward, her green eyes sharp and steady. "You're stronger than you think, Lily. You've already taken the hardest step, walking away. Now it's time to focus on healing." "Healing sounds nice," I muttered bitterly. "But how do I even start?" "One day at a time," she replied simply. "And maybe you need to remind yourself of who you are outside of him, who you were before James." Her words stuck with me as I left the shop later that evening. Walking home, I thought about the person I used to be, the ambitious college grad who dreamed of becoming a writer, the adventurous traveler who backpacked across Europe solo, the friend who always showed up for others no matter what. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost sight of that version of myself, letting James define me instead. But now I had the chance to find her again. When I returned to the apartment, James was there. He stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes, looking bewildered and guilty all at once. For a second, neither of us spoke. We just stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between us. Finally, he broke the silence. "What is all this?" His voice was strained, almost accusatory. "I'm leaving," I said flatly, setting my bag down on the couch. "It's over, James." His expression shifted rapidly. Shock, anger, desperation, all flickering across his face like scenes from a movie reel. "Lily, don't do this. We can fix it. Whatever I did wrong, I'll make it right." "No, you won't," I shot back, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "Because deep down, you don't even see what's wrong. You think saying I'm sorry will magically erase everything, but it doesn't work like that. Love isn't supposed to hurt this much." He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. "Save it. I'm done trying to save us. Go be with Sarah, or whoever else makes you happier than me. Just leave me alone." And then I walked past him, heading straight for the bedroom to grab the last of my things. Behind me, I heard him call my name once, twice, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because turning around would mean seeing the man I loved fading into the stranger he'd become, and I didn't have the strength for that goodbye. That night, I slept on Aria's couch, curled up under a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender. Exhaustion pulled me under quickly, but even in sleep, I couldn't escape the ache in my chest. Still, somewhere deep inside, there was a flicker of hope, a tiny spark, reminding me that endings aren't always final. Sometimes they're just beginnings in disguise. The first week after leaving James felt like living underwater. Everything was muffled, distorted, and just out of reach. Days blurred into nights, and I oscillated between moments of clarity and overwhelming waves of grief. Aria's couch became my safe haven, though safe might be a stretch. It wasn't exactly comfortable, and every time I moved, the springs dug into my back like little reminders that life was still uncomfortable. But it was better than going back to him. Aria checked on me constantly, bringing me cups of chamomile tea and forcing me to eat actual meals instead of surviving on toast and peanut butter. She had this knack for knowing when to push and when to give me space, which was equal parts comforting and infuriating. One evening, after finding me staring blankly at the TV while reruns of some sitcom played in the background, she sat down beside me and said, "You can't keep doing this. Lily, you're not a ghost. You need to start living again." "I'm trying," I muttered, pulling the blanket tighter around myself, "but everything feels heavy." "Of course it does," she replied gently. "You just went through a breakup. That doesn't magically get fixed overnight. But sitting here feeling sorry for yourself isn't helping either. You've got to take control of your life now, not wait for it to happen to you." Her words stung, but they also lit a fire under me. Maybe it was her tone, firm yet caring, or maybe it was the realization that she was right. Sitting around, wallowing wasn't going to change anything. If I wanted to move forward, I had to do something about it. about it. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. Well, sort of. It wasn't much of a plan, really. More like a vague idea scribbled on a sticky note. Writing had always been my escape before James came along. Back in college, I used to fill notebooks with short stories and poems, pouring my heart onto the page whenever life felt too chaotic. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped writing altogether, convinced that dedicating myself to our relationship meant sacrificing other parts of me. Now, I wondered if picking up a pen again could help me rediscover who I was. I dug through one of my unpacked boxes until I found an old journal buried beneath sweaters and scarves. The cover was worn, its edges frayed from years of use, but flipping it open brought back memories of late-night study sessions and lazy Sunday mornings spent jotting down random thoughts. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wrote something just for me. Dear future me, if you're reading this, it means you survived. Congratulations. Right now, everything feels impossible, like climbing a mountain made entirely of broken glass. But trust me when I say this, it gets better. You are stronger than you think, braver than you feel, and more capable than you believe. Don't let anyone, including past versions of yourself, convince you otherwise. Tears welled up as I read the words aloud, my voice trembling. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was honest. And honesty, I realized, was something I hadn't allowed myself to embrace in a long time. As the days turned into weeks, I started venturing outside more often. At first, it was just short walks around the block or trips to the grocery store to stock up on essentials. Then, one chilly Saturday afternoon, Arya dragged me to a local farmer's market. Fresh air will do you good, she insisted, practically shoving me out the door. At first, I resented being forced out of my self-imposed exile. The market was crowded and noisy, filled with vendors shouting about their produce and musicians playing folksy tunes on acoustic guitars. But as we wandered from stall to stall, something shifted inside me. The smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the earthy scent of herbs and spices. Bright colors popped everywhere. Piles of ripe tomatoes, bouquets of sunflowers, jars of honey glinting in the sunlight. It was chaotic and messy and alive, and for the first time in ages, I felt present. You should start coming here regularly, Arya suggested as we sipped hot cider near a pumpkin stand. Maybe even sell some of your own stuff someday. Own stuff? I asked skeptically. Like what? She shrugged. Whatever makes you happy. Art, crafts, baked goods. Hell, write a book and set up a booth selling signed copies. People love that kind of thing. The idea sounded ridiculous, at least at first, but the more I thought about it, the more appealing it became. Why not? What did I have to lose? That night, I opened my laptop and started typing. Not poetry or short stories this time, but something bigger, a novel. The plot came to me almost fully formed, inspired by my own experiences, but fictionalized enough to feel safe. It was about a woman named Olivia, who leaves her toxic relationship and embarks on a journey of self-discovery, meeting quirky characters and learning valuable lessons along the way. Writing it felt cathartic, like I was exercising all the pain and anger I'd been carrying around for months. Progress was slow at first. I averaged about 500 words a day, struggling to find the right balance between raw emotion and coherent storytelling. But gradually, the words began flowing easier. Characters developed personalities of their own, dialogue felt natural, and scenes unfolded effortlessly. By the end of the month, I had a solid outline and several completed chapters. Meanwhile, I started reconnecting with old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Some reached out after seeing updates on social media. Others I contacted myself, hesitant but hopeful. To my surprise, most were thrilled to hear from me, eager to catch up and offer support. There was Emma, my college roommate, who listened patiently as I rambled about James over video chat, and Marcus, my former coworker, who invited me to join his weekly trivia team. Slowly but surely, I began piecing together a new version of my life, one that didn't revolve around James. It wasn't perfect, and there were still days when sadness crept in uninvited, but those moments grew fewer and farther between, replaced by small victories and quiet joys. One evening, as I sat cross-legged on Arya's floor surrounded by drafts of my manuscript, she looked at me and smiled. "You're glowing," she said softly, "like you're finally finding yourself again." I glanced down at the pages scattered around me, each one a testament to how far I'd come. "Yeah," I replied, smiling back. "I think I am." It had been 6 months since I left James, and life felt different. Not perfect, far from it, but lighter somehow. Like I'd shed a layer of skin that no longer fit. My mornings were no longer filled with dread or anxiety about what mood he'd be in when he woke up. Instead, they started with quiet rituals, brewing a pot of strong coffee, journaling by the window as sunlight streamed in, and sometimes even sneaking in a yoga session before heading out for the day. I was learning how to exist without him, and more importantly, how to exist for myself. The novel I'd been working on was nearly finished. At first, writing it felt like therapy, a way to process everything I'd gone through, but now it felt like something more. It was becoming a piece of me, something tangible that could stand on its own. The protagonist, Olivia, had grown into this fierce, flawed, yet deeply relatable character who reminded me so much of myself during those dark days after James left. She made mistakes, stumbled, and doubted herself constantly, but she also fought her way back to the light. Finishing her story felt like finishing my own healing process. One afternoon, while editing the final chapters at a cozy cafe downtown, I received received an email from a literary agent named Lucas Bennett. He'd reached out after seeing my query letter online, a short summary of the book and why I thought it deserved attention. His message was brief but encouraging. Hi Lily, I came across your manuscript pitch and found it intriguing. Would love to read more? If you're interested, please send over the full draft. Looking forward to hearing from you soon. I stared at the screen for a solid 5 minutes, rereading the words over and over to make sure I wasn't imagining them. This was it, the moment I dreamed about for years, but never allowed myself to believe would actually happen. With trembling hands, I attached the file and hit send. Then I called Arya immediately. He wants to read the whole thing, I exclaimed, practically bouncing in my seat. What if he hates it? What if it's terrible? What if— Stop, she interrupted firmly. You are brilliant, talented, and ridiculously hardworking. If anyone can pull this off, it's you. Her confidence in me was infectious, and for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I was capable of achieving something big. A few weeks later, Lucas responded. His feedback was thorough and thoughtful, pointing out areas where the pacing lagged or certain characters needed more depth. But overall, his tone was positive, and he ended the email with 3 simple words: let's work together. That night, I celebrated with Emma, Marcus, and Arya at our favorite Italian restaurant. We ordered way too much food, drank cheap wine until we were tipsy, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. For the first time in years, I felt truly surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, not because they wanted something from me, but because they saw value in who I was. You know, Emma said between bites of tiramisu, this feels like one of those cheesy rom-com endings where the girl realizes she doesn't need the guy to be happy. Except instead of landing some dreamboat prince, you landed a book deal. Everyone laughed, including me, though her comment struck a chord. Leaving James hadn't just freed me from a toxic relationship, it had given me permission to pursue dreams I'd abandoned long ago. Writing wasn't just a hobby anymore, it was my career, my passion, my purpose. Fast forward another year, and my debut novel, Finding Olivia, hit shelves. The launch party was held at Arya's flower shop, transformed into a whimsical wonderland with fairy lights, stacks of books, and bouquets everywhere. Friends, family, and even strangers showed up to celebrate, a testament to how far I'd come since those lonely nights crying on Arya's couch. James sent me a text the day the book came out, just 4 words: congrats, you did well. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, remind him of all the ways he'd failed me, but another part, the stronger, wiser part, knew it didn't matter anymore. He wasn't part of my story anymore, and honestly, I didn't want him to be. Instead, I deleted the message and turned my phone off for the rest of the night. Tonight wasn't about him, it was about me, about celebrating everything I'd overcome and everything I'd achieved. As the evening wound down and guests trickled out, I stood outside the shop, sipping champagne and watching the stars peek out one by one. Arya joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. So, she said with a grin, what's next for Lily Harper? I smiled, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Whatever I want, and for the first time, in forever, I believed it.